Namaste. Namostu Ramaya Salakshmanaya Devyai Tatasye Janakatmajayai Namostu Rudra Indra Yamanilebhyo Namostu Chandrarka Marudganebhyaha. Today we are now into the 7th week, the final week of our course on sense of past towards realizing Rāma Rājya. The previous 6 weeks have been each week with a particular theme. We have tried to see the manner in which we can think about Rāma Rājya by looking at varieties of ways by which Rāma Rājya has been understood in the contemporary times as well as in the past. One of the most significant challenge that was posed to the very idea of Rāma Rājya as understood in the Shastras has been erected by modernity, and one does indeed find that the influence of that has shaped a number of critiques which are currently in vogue about Ramayana and the character of Rama himself. So we tried to look at one such point when we discussed the Shambhuka Vadha, and specifically in the context of the challenge to Chaturvarnya that Dr. Ambedkar has spent good amount of time in terms of trying to point out what are the kinds of issues that must necessarily face for a person who intends to speak of Chaturvarnya while also embracing not a hierarchical approach, but the way in which Arya Samajis would like to point out about the idea of Varna as being something that is decided based on karma, but not by janma. So this is a point that we have actually tried to look at and also tried to address. In what manners can Chaturvarnya be understood in a sense in which its sense of the universality is captured, and it is also something that we tried to portray in the light of the senses by which sovereignty itself could be understood in the current times. So this was the focus of the 6th week's session. And one of the key points why we are currently able to talk about or rather say, have an extensive discussion about Rāma Rājya is the enablement of the construction of Rama Mandira at the Ramajanmabhoomi in Ayodhya. You would be aware that the nature of this entire exercise did not start or did not occur in a smooth manner. There's an extensive kind of fight and a court battle which ran into few decades, which then resulted in the court judgment, which with all its conditionalities has agreed for the construction of Rama Mandira at what has been believed to be Rama-janmabhoomi. And this sequence of how it unfolded and the nature of the Supreme Court judgment itself requires to be analyzed to be in a position to understand whether the Rama Rājya that flows out of the nature of that judgment, would it indeed be something that matches the kind of thoughts that we associate with Maryada Purushottama Rama. It is in this light that in the final week session of this course, our theme is Sanatana Maryada Sanmata Siddhanta. And the use of Sanatana Maryada here is something that has been spoken of in a number of senses by different thinkers. And one of the most important discussions in this slide, to my understanding, which we have in public space discussions, is that of Professor Ramachandra Gandhi, who wrote an entire work which he titled as Sita's Kitchen, an inquiry into testimony of, he called it as a testimony of faith and inquiry. So it is important that this testimony of faith and inquiry that Professor Ramachandra Gandhi has brought to our attention is something that we indeed take into account in order to understand Sanatana Siddhanta as well as the Sanatana Maryada as well as Sanmata Siddhanta that we intend to arrive at, that would indeed pave a path towards realizing Rama Rājya. So I'd like to share the screen on of Sita's Kitchen. We'd say read through some of the very important aspects that are listed in here. I hope that, just a second, this is not the one. Yes, I hope you're able to see the text. There is there are a few chapters of it which are available in the Google preview, and to my knowledge, that suffices for us to make a case, understand Professor Ramachandra Gandhi's point, as well as see from where this can actually be taken further. I just say read out from the abstract. In the introduction, Professor Ramachandra Gandhi raises Ayodhya issue to international and universal levels. In the text, he offers a solution on the local and national levels. The Temple Mount in Ayodhya, the sacred hill in which the present Babri Masjid was built, also known as Sita's Kitchen, was originally a sacred place of the Adivasis, the aboriginal inhabitants of the subcontinent. It was sacred to the goddess, the great nurturing earth, the fecund source of all life, the aboriginal presupposition of all later religions. As an aboriginal place sacred to the mother goddess, the hill in Ayodhya brings together all religions. Rather than a source of conflict, Ayodhya should become a meeting ground for the divergent religious traditions of the world to see their ultimate harmony. That desire is indeed something that indeed must be shared, but the formulation and the kind of sense of past within which Professor Ramachandra Gandhi places it is itself something that requires us to revisit and also critique what is stated in Sita's Kitchen. So I'd like to read some parts of it, not all. There are a number of points. He actually gives a background about his own, say, early childhood and his mother, and the manner in which, say, he relates to his mother, and also the way in which he finds a source for the response to what is happening in India when there was high communal tension. This was prior to the demolition of Babri Masjid. This was something that got published in the March of 1992. And it actually also anticipated that such a thing would indeed happen. So we are to keep in mind the sense in which this places itself. And we'll also look at the kind of description that it gives of the movement which today we know of as the movement for Rama-janmabhoomi, which we would indeed find is a case that our current Prime Minister, Shri Narendra Modi, has indeed asserted that it was no less than Indian national movement. So this was the very words that he used when he spoke on the occasion of the foundation laying ceremony of the Rama Mandira at Ramajanmabhoomi. So I'd like to start reading from the 12th part of the prologue. So, injured Hindu pride is being morally bullied and cajoled. To perceive a 16th century mosque in Ayodhya, the Babri Mosque, as the very embodiment of otherness, sheer indissoluble otherness, as Advaita's Waterloo. The sense in which Professor Ramchandra Gandhi uses Advaita, we've already looked at his statement of untouchability as Advaita's shame, where his specific reference is to non-duality of the entire world and the being, and this is not technically in the same sense as the sense of Advaita that one finds in Shankara's formulation or the various other kinds of formulations of Advaita in the amongst the darshanas of India, Astika darshanas of India. So as Advaita's Waterloo, because it indeed differentiates Hindus and Muslims. So that is the sense in which this is being used. The mosque's Babri Masjid stands on a high and wide mound, which Hindu piety identifies as the area somewhere within which Sri Rama was born datelessly long ago, and also as the area somewhere within which was situated his wife's, Sri Sita's kitchen. Now, the existence of a mosque within this ambience of sacredness need not as such hurt Hindu pride. It can easily be seen as proof of the accommodatingness of Hinduism's spiritual sensibility. This itself requires to be seen, and I do want to spend some time on this point equally. Indeed, in normal circumstances, the topographical inclusion of a mosque within the sacred precincts of Rama's birthplace and Sita's kitchen. So the reference to Sita's kitchen comes because when the Rama-janmabhoomi movement was at its peak, and there was a lot of activities that is indeed happening, the case turns out that we are now placed in a scenario where the sense of Indian partition and the memories of partition of India were being brought back to life after a relatively peaceful few decades. And it is in that formulation that when Professor Ramchandra Gandhi was left with no clue as to how can one indeed reflect on what is happening, he went to Ayodhya and went around the three domes of Babri Masjid, and he noticed that as he was circumambulating the central dome, he noticed that on one side of it, there was a point written there, Janmasthan Sita ki Rasoi. And this is from where his imagination as well as reflective account of this particular testimony in faith and inquiry began. So the fact that, say, Rama-janmabhoomi was not just Rama-janmabhoomi, but also Sita ki Rasoi, is where the entire reflective space has been placed. And that is indeed the reason why this must be looked at with sufficient care, because there is a claim that is made with respect to what we ought to understand as the Sanatana Maryada and Sanmata Siddhanta. So indeed, in normal circumstances, the topographical inclusion of a mosque within the sacred precincts of Rama's birthplace and Sita's kitchen would convey a message of profound and special spiritual significance, and I will return to this theme. The times, however, are not normal in India today, communally speaking. Islamic secessionism in Kashmir, you would be aware that it was in 1989 onwards that the terrorist activities in Kashmir and the exodus of Kashmiri Pandits happened in a very rapid manner. So this was written during that time. So, and imitative Sikh secessionism, you would also be aware that the quelling of the Khalistani movement by Shri KPS Gill was something that also was something that happened during this turbulent times in Punjab, assisted by successfully seceded Pakistan, have yielded a frightening Hindu backlash in the country, which enables Hindu fundamentalism to use communal memory of old historical wrongs to reap rich political profits for itself. The chief art of Indian civilization is the ability to turn worldly adversity to spiritual advantage. Attempts to right the wrongs of the past by wrongs of the present will be the death of this art and possibly also of Indian civilization. I repeat this very important assertion. The chief art of Indian civilization is the ability to turn worldly adversity to spiritual advantage. Attempts to right the wrongs of the past by the wrongs of the present will be the death of this art and possibly also of Indian civilization. Politically and communicatively, powerful Hindu organizations are claiming, without authority of any body of extant archaeological or literary evidence, secular or sacred. Please notice that it was in the year 2003 that the Allahabad High Court, Lucknow bench has ordered for Archaeological Survey of India's thorough report on what it is that one finds in the place where Babri Masjid was demolished. So at that moment, there was, of course, an archaeological report of Professor B.B. Lal, which did make a claim that there was pre-existent temple-like structure in the near places of Babri Masjid. So it is in that context that Professor Ramchandra Gandhi is writing, without the authority of any body of extant archaeological or literary evidence. So the literary evidence is something that as on today, of course, you do find a number of aspects which are relating to it that are also presented, though whether they are accepted to the other party or not is something that is quite clear post the Supreme Court judgment that the evidences presented are not universally accepted. So secular or sacred, which cannot be seriously questioned. So please notice the point about what Professor Ramchandra Gandhi is pointing out, that there indeed are questions about whatever are the nature of evidences that are present, that the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya stands precisely at the spot where Rama was born and where there once stood a temple commemorating his birth. This temple, it is alleged, was destroyed at the behest of Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, which symbolized the pinnacle of Islamic power in India. and that mosque was built at its site, incorporating some of the materials and structures of the destroyed temple, which were suitably defaced for the purpose, but not entirely, so as to let them bear the humiliating testimony of the conquest of Hindu India by Muslim forces and the forcible conversion of Hindus to Islam. And all this at a commanding height in one of the holiest Hindu shrines, the capital city of God incarnate, Rama's kingdom on earth, Ayodhya. Please notice that Ayodhya is also the first amongst the 7 puris which are stated to be the ones which are which when one visits, one attains moksha. Conquered, cannibalized, converted. This is the message of humiliation which the Hindu psyche is being forced to regard the Babri Mosque as broadcasting ceaselessly from the summit of Ayodhya across more than 4 centuries. Relocate the mosque somewhere else, although it deserves to be destroyed, and reconstruct at the liberated site the original temple, or build a new one commemorating the birth and birthplace of Rama. This is the vindictive demand of Hindu assertiveness today in Ayodhya, unworthy of Hinduism. Professor Ramchandra Gandhi's understanding of Hinduism is much different from those who stated this, and unnecessary for piety, which has plunged India into a major political crisis and a communal convulsion which has already taken hundreds of lives. But it is not only Hindu pride that is hurt. It is claimed by Hindu organizations agitating for the relocation of the Babri Mosque that on the night of December 22nd or during the early hours of December 23rd, 1949, images of Sri Rama and Sri Sita miraculously manifested inside the mosque. All evidence available points to the contrary, not to a miracle, but to trespass, to the fact that the images were placed inside the mosque surreptitiously by zealots who broke into it at night for the purpose. Fearing the outbreak of violence in the communally surcharged atmosphere of the time, barely 2 years after the Holocaust of India's partition, district authorities put a lock on the mosque, forbidding Muslim prayers in it. 37 years later, in 1986, an avowedly secular Congress government, anxious to woo Hindu voters, caused a pliant judge to order the breaking open of the lock on the mosque, but not the removal of the images, opening the floodgates of fundamentalism. This forcible conversion of a mosque into a temple, not in the years immediately following the trauma of partition, but decades later, and with the apparent connivance of government, has deeply wounded Muslim sensibility in India. Politically and communicatively, powerful Muslim organizations have not lagged behind their Hindu counterparts in working up the faithful into a idealization which sought to cherish both secularism and spirituality. The child and the adult turned in desperation to Sri Ramana. Help was at hand. I opened my eyes. My attention was drawn to what I had not noticed the first time around, a signboard of quite contemporary origin which said in Hindi, Janmasthan Sita ki Rasoi, that is, birthplace Rama's, Sita's kitchen. My eyes and heart were open to a neglected but crucial aspect of the Ayodhya controversy. Media accounts of the controversy had made no mention of the fact that the Babri Mosque was located in a zone of the Ramkot Mound, which was revered by Hindu devotees not only as Rama's birthplace, but also as Sita's kitchen. The voluminous mosque-baiting propaganda of Hindu indignation was also devoid of any reference to Sita's kitchen. Bitterness sought in a male supremacist way to commemorate Rama and banish Sita from memory, even as the male supremacist citizenry of Ayodhya in the Ramayana had crowned Rama and caused the banishment of Sita. A script of tragedy deeply encoded in consciousness was demanding to be replayed. I want to repeat this entire paragraph because this is one of the three major points against Rama, both as a ruler and as a character, as somebody who ought to be, who has been, say, hailed as Maryada Purushottama. Bitterness sought in a male supremacist way to commemorate Rama and banish Sita from memory, even as the male supremacist citizenry of Ayodhya in the Ramayana had crowned Rama and caused the banishment of Sita. A script of tragedy deeply encoded in consciousness was demanding to be replayed. The Hindi phrase Sita ki rasoi has a resonance which the English translation Sita's kitchen does not have for me. An ambience of domesticity and divinity which happily includes the pious notion of an actual kitchen where Godhead incarnate, Sita, cooked delicious and nutritious food for the Raghava household, but stretches all the way beyond that architectural idea to the archetypal notion of the earth as the Divine Mother's laboratory of manifestation and field of nourishment for all self-images of self. This is, of course, following his focus of Advaita. The sacred words, birthplace Sita's kitchen, posted above the main arch of the mosque, held the time bomb in self-realizing self-restraint and formed a banner headline without whose guidance it would be impossible to read that stone story as revealing anything but shame. I took those words as Guru Ramana's gift of a saving mantra to embattled Indian civilization in ironically, quote unquote, unbattleable Ayodhya. It is more than a year since my eyes were opened to that magic inscription in crude paint, and my heart and mind will continue to meditate on the meaning of that inscription long after the Ayodhya dispute is resolved, as I hope by the grace of Rama and Sita and Ramana it will be. So we today know what exactly is the way in which it has shaped up. So therefore, it indeed is good to actually look at some of these words by one of the very important modern day thinkers of India. The element Sita's kitchen in the compound phrase birthplace Sita's kitchen can be read as an answer written against the item birthplace in a column of questions regarding Rama or any manifest form, avataric or ordinary. And the Sita, whose kitchen is also the birthplace of Rama, is only in manifestation his consort. In reality, she is Mahalakshmi, Godhead self. And Sita's kitchen is the entire field of her self-imaging Shakti, powerfully represented by the earth. It is on earth, in the embrace of the Divine Mother, that all are born, all creatures great and small, all forms manifest, noble or evil, and all are nourished. I have no doubt at all that at least the northern portion of the Ramkot mound in Ayodhya must have been in antiquity a sacred fertility grove, an aboriginal shrine of the Divine Mother which acquired the name Sita's kitchen during the Ramayana age without the slightest loss of significance. The Ramkot zone sheltering the Babri Mosque is as a whole Sita's kitchen and also every part and portion of it. Any number of kitchen shrines can be established there. One such is a platform outside the mosque's northern wall, whose deities are a rolling board and a rolling pin, powerful symbols of generativeness and humble apparatus of bread making, decidedly of aboriginal authenticity in conception. Likewise, the zone as a whole is Rama's birthplace, and every part and portion of it and every point on its surface. Any number of birthplace shrines can be established there. One such is a platform, the Ram Chabutra, near the mosque's main entrance. For a long time, when the mosque's main entrance was closed for Hindus it was the Ram Chabutra that Hindus used to worship, is what we also get to know from the kind of records that we currently have. And the Babri Mosque could also be regarded as a birthplace shrine. It could always have been so regarded even before the images of Rama and Sita were stealthily installed inside it, and without the necessity of that act of trespass and appropriation. I'd like to read this paragraph, this part once again. And the Babri Mosque could also be regarded as a birthplace shrine. It could always have been so regarded, even before the images of Rama and Sita were stealthily installed inside it, and without the necessity of that act of trespass and appropriation. Because the mosque falls within the sacred birthplace and kitchen area, and every structure situated within that area is simultaneously a birthplace shrine of Rama and a kitchen shrine of Sita, with or without the benefit of the installation and consecration and worship of sacred images inside the structure. The insistence that the sanctum sanctorum of the mosque is the precise and exclusive place of Rama's birth is blasphemy, not faith. And of course, it is not theology or archaeology or history. It is not blasphemous to hold a zone, a finite surface, to be the birthplace area, every part and portion of it, because such a zone, so understood, would be a lucid image of omnipresence, Rama's Godhead's self's omnipresent. What is blasphemous is the denial of omnipresence by imposing the task of imaging it exclusively on any one spot in the zone area. This is what Hindu narrow-mindedness is doing Hinduism, denyingly, by accusing Babri Mosque of standing on the supposedly singular spot marking Rama's birth. The spiritual motifs carved on the pillars and stones of Babri Mosque are common to Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, and the location of the mosque in the sacred kitchen zone of Ramkot draws pointed attention to the kinship of these traditions with aboriginal spirituality. In thus drawing attention to the coherent spiritual universe of aboriginality, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, the mosque makes a stupendous contribution to Indian self-knowledge. Ought such a teacher be allowed to be banished by ungrateful pupils? The apparent intractable otherness of the mosque as a reminder of historical humiliation is overcome in the intimacy of kinship establishing self-knowledge, to which that sentinel of Ramkot awakens the grieving pride of Hinduism. Not only that, the Babri Mosque's medieval trespass into the kitchen area dramatizes the entry of Sufism into the corpus of Indian mysticism. Indeed, the cognateness of Abrahamic mysticism in general, and not only Sufism, with Hindu, Aboriginal, and Buddhist mysticism, is powerfully suggested by the continuity of the mosque's inner space of objectlessness with the void of the kitchen zone, which is continuous with the sphericality of the earth and with surrounding emptiness. And this continuity, along with the autonomy of each area of emptiness, is deeply evocative of ahimsa or nonviolence, the virtue emphasized centrally by Jainism and savingly by Gandhi in our annihilationist age. Indian spiritual self-knowledge cannot become self-realization without encounter with non-Indian spiritual traditions and without sharing space and time with them. Held in topographical and historical embrace by the birthplace and kitchen zone of Ayodhya, the Babri Mosque is evidence not of Hindu humiliation, but of its venturesome sadhana of self-realization. The apparent insurmountable otherness of the mosque as a representative of exclusivism is softened by the realization which the interloper in Ramkot forces upon nativist Indian spirituality, namely that its universe has been widened by Islam's presence in India. But what about the interloping images in the mosque? So these are the points that get discussed further to primarily make a claim which has possibly been very succinctly captured in a particular paragraph bitterness sought in a male supremacist way to commemorate Rama and banish Sita from memory, even as the male supremacist citizenry of Ayodhya in the Ramayana had crowned Rama and caused the banishment of Sita. A script of tragedy deeply encoded in consciousness was demanding to be replayed. This, and following this, the other point that indeed requires to be brought to attention is the decidedly of aboriginal authenticity in conception. So we have indeed spent some time in an earlier session on the sense of Purana Vairam. And one would indeed notice that this particular point which Professor Ramchandra Gandhi has spoken of has all elements of what we ought to call as Purana Vairam. And it also has a point that it made with respect to the point on what happened on the night or the early hours of December 23rd, 1949 Common Era, and what ought to be the way in which India deals with the question of partitioning of undivided India. It also poses a question about in what manner can this exercise be the current exercise of building a Rama Mandira, can it be turned to spiritual advantage? The chief art of Indian civilization is the ability to turn worldly adversity to spiritual advantage. Attempts to right the wrongs of the past by wrongs of the present will be the death of this art and possibly also of Indian civilization. So I indeed want to take this point quite seriously and want to bring to your attention some of the kinds of points that Professor Ramchandra Gandhi made. Indeed, are faces the conflict as the conflict between the conflict of a sense of past that arises from the modern sensibility of looking at modern historical, archaeological, and the formulation of the world and the founding of the world on scientific, based on the scientific unfolding of evolution, as opposed to that of the sense that one would find of the story of Srishti that one finds in Purana, Sarga, Pratisarga, Manvantara. So these are contrasts which are indeed present, and clearly you see that the entire argument and the manner in which this exercise of trying to find a pathway out, because Professor Ramchandra Gandhi goes on to say, take the idea from a Buddhist story, and he wants to speak of a character, a female character, who he called as an Adivasi. So in fact, the term Adivasi itself is something that you wouldn't find as a usage which was existent prior to, say, the British rule in India. So the claim of Adivasis is something that also finds its echo quite strongly when one looks at the way in which the discussions happened during the Constituent Assembly, where the Adivasis or the tribals who are currently present in the forests, their claim to this land is of a higher nature than that of those who have come from elsewhere, because the belief that, say, there are a number of people who have come from elsewhere and settled in here is a point that does come in various eras of Indian past. So the formulation of any of these kind of questions indeed brings to question the sense of the past that we are actually, say, placed with. So what is the manner in which this sense of past that is present, that is inherited, and the way in which, say, one could read what happened? So in fact, a key question can be asked: what is it that happened on the 6th of December 1992 Common Era? So there is a simple enough answer to say that demolition of Babri Masjid happened there. And the next question indeed would be, is it the case that all those who were involved, would they also see that it is the demolition of Babri Masjid? And there is also the point made about this specific way in which the trespass of by zealots of the images of Sri Rama, which is the Ramlala Virajman that we today know of, into the say central dome of Babri Masjid. How do we understand and the context in which this is placed? Unless, say, there is a background past of this which is pointed out, then the nature of this particular occurrence, which is not a miracle but as a matter of trespass, and that trespass is of course seen based on, say, the contemporary law. So I'd like to say take this question and take you back to some stories which are not directly present in the history books that we get to see, because the legends that actually play out about the finding or the location of Rama-janmabhoomi, as we have read out in a previous session, the Sthala Purana of Ayodhya points to the way in which that legendary king Vikramarka, whose historicity itself is not accepted as per modern history, how he has built a temple at Ayodhya, and it was he who, with the help of meditating on the Rama mantra, and also with the help of a young calf, which, when roaming around the area of what we today know of as Rama-janmabhoomi, stopped there and started giving milk. So this young calf, female calf, giving milk is itself a very miraculous story that is embedded into the Sthala Purana of Ayodhya, and it is from there that the location of the exact place where Rama was born has been found by Vikramarka, and since then there is a claim that that memory has been preserved, and that preserved memory is what makes people identify that specific place as Rama-janmabhoomi. And the claim that say this belief of the exact location as blasphemy that Professor Ramchandra Gandhi speaks of is indeed basing itself on the point that such kind of Sthala Puranas are not to be treated as authentic. Though, of course, there are a number of these stories that he indeed uses to weave his, say, account of what he sees as an original myth of the Sita's kitchen, by trying to bring together what we today understand as the categories which are acceptable to the constitutional framework post-independence. So the Adivasi, Aboriginals, these formulations are some things that are acceptable and also find their place in the current contemporary discourse. So bring these aspects in the light of this, and correspondingly there's a argument made, and that argument is something that was made prior to the demolition of the Babri Mosque, and that say it was also say foreseen within this point, and to try and the nature of say the Hindu-Muslim conflict and the hatred of one for the other, if any, how it could be neutralized by way of claiming something which is of a different order has been a major exercise that Sita's Kitchen as a book attempts. But more importantly, to think of male supremacist citizenry of Ayodhya is a point which actually goes contra to the very understanding of what one would call as Sanatana Dharma. Because we do find that the reference to Sanatana Dharma in one of the statements that we find in Mahabharata. So there is this instance that you would be aware of, where in Kshetra, when Pandavas were residing in the home of a Brahmana, and in that place, every day, one person has to be sacrificed for feeding Bakasura. And when the turn of this Brahman's household comes, where Pandavas along with Kunti were residing, then there's a discussion within which we notice in the sequence of the Esha Dharma Sanatanaha, the lady, a Brahmin lady, tells that I would like to sacrifice myself, because even if it were to be by giving up one's life to create an environment for pleasing the husband is Sanatana Dharma for a beautiful wife. Now, this is a formulation which many of the modern sensibilities wouldn't actually accept by any means. And that is also because the sense of the sacrality and the sense of the sacrament that Hindu marriage is something that one may not possibly say understand. And at the same time, this formulation that Rama and Sita could indeed be separated and seen as two different individuals is also not something that can be ever claimed to be found in Itihasa nor in the Purana. So the sense of past that actually tries to differentiate it is something that comes from a ground which is elsewhere. Now, it is important that, say, before we speak of the Rama Rājya, the charge that Rama, so Shambhuka Vadha has been addressed by pointing out that the punishment that was given to Shambhuka would have been the same had it been somebody else also, because we have a precedent in Trishanku. So that was something that we did discuss. When it comes to the other two instances, one that of the killing of Vali, which basing on the modern day formulations, it would be termed as a cold-blooded murder. And the other was the banishment of Sita and the injustice done unto Sita not once but twice over, because Sita was forced to undergo a test, Agni Pariksha, in Lanka before she was brought to Ayodhya. And on the same count of her staying elsewhere, the citizens of Ayodhya raised suspicion. And it also turns out that at that moment she was pregnant. So this entire formulation brings to a question, what exactly is the way in which this, say, society and its norms, values are to be understood, not based on, say, the current formulations of male supremacism or the feminine sense of moderation that is required, because that kind of a binary is what is the latest binary that we have come to say accept in the sequences of seeking equality. That is one of the abstract ideas that has been having its sway in the world today. So in the sense of even you notice that, say, one of the most important occurrences in modern times where for the first time, say, there is a United Nations effort to try and bring in faith as important element that cannot be set aside in the formulation of human rights. There's a movement which is currently on, which calls itself as Faith for Rights, wherein one of the key aspects that will try to, say, bring about a common platform where there is gender equality as a kind of measure is something that is the current kind of idea of utopia. So this current kind of idea of utopia, what it actually presents and where exactly it takes, is a point that indeed has to be, say, looked at in sufficient detail. So my intent of trying to bring this to attention is to say that the claim or the kind of move towards realizing Rama Rājya indeed would have to debate these ideas which are actually being populated in the current world as a direction towards the manner in which we ought to strive towards, and that is the sense of utopia. That sense of utopia, how far is it meaningful, is a question that must indeed be addressed, and what is the kind of ground in which it has to be done is a question that also requires to be thought of. So let us ask the question about what is it that is the significance of Rama Rājya. There have been number of kings of yore. In fact, there are probably, say, greater kings than Rama. And one story I must have probably brought to your attention is that Rama was not born in Rama Vamsha. Neither is the case that his own dynasty was after him was called as Rama Vamsha. He is born in Raghu Vamsha. So that Rama is considered as Raghukula Tilaka would call for us to understand that Raghu Maharaja must have been of a greater ruler than Rama himself. The key point is we still speak of Rama Rājya, and what is it that is the most significant aspect of Rama Rājya that must be understood is that we have actually seen some examples and some points that dharma, artha, kama, moksha of all people in Rama Rājya, they were attained, and people, so the key point is the fourth one. So Rama was someone who has ensured that all his people, they attain moksha. So I believe, say, I brought to your attention that one of the very fascinating recountings of Rama Rājya, which Swami Karpatriji in one of his writings points out by bringing out, say, the rasa that is present in the peoples of the Kosala Rajya. So one day at night in Rama Rājya, spies of Rama were going around and they overheard from a specific house where there was a mother who was giving her young child her breast milk. And while she was giving her breast milk, the young child was infant, was not desirous of drinking milk. So we do notice that this scene happens many a times, and then the mother tells the infant, "My dear son, do have the pleasure of the nectar from my breast, because you who are born in Rama Rājya would not have the same kind of the experience of nectar in another birth, because there wouldn't be another birth to follow. So that moksha is the sense of liberation from the birth and rebirth cycle that one indeed has to get out of. And that is the state that is desirable, is at the core of what we understand as the Sanatana Dharma. So that Rama Rājya, when all the citizenry of Ayodhya, when they were actually guaranteed to attain moksha, what exactly would have been the kind of reason where this particular point of Sita being questioned come after so many years? So it's a very interesting thing to notice that the memory of the number of years of Rama's rule that we find is 11,000 years. And Dasavarsha Sahasrani, Dasavarsha Sitani Cha is the shloka. And that is something that we find in Valmiki, and it is also found in the memory of the same when Narada narrates to Srinjaya the story of Shodasa Maharaja, which I have shared with you earlier. So the fact that Rama reigned for 11,000 years, when was it that Sita was banished once they came back after Ravanavadha? So this would actually turn out to be in the last 100 years. That is to say that amongst the 11,000 years of Rama's reign, even if one actually takes the term Varsha to mean a single day, as at one point you find Bhima tell Yudhishthira that Varsha is equivalent to a single day. So we are asked to go on 12 Varshas of exile. So it is equivalent to 12 days and 1 day in Ajñātavasa. So that Yudhishthira counters that is a separate story, but there is that formulation as well. And the other thing, if one intends to take that Varsha, not in terms of the human years, but if it were to be taken to be one Varsha is one rainfall. And imagining that, say, there are 3 rains, because there is a popular notion that in Rama Rājya, because it was Dharma Rājya, there was timely rains, and timely rains would mean that each month there would be 3 showers. In that way, if each were taken to be 1 shower, so if Varsha is taken in that sense, then also there will be 36 per annum, and 11,000 divided by 36 is what would be the number of years. And in all of these, it is the last sense when the story of the banishment of Sita to Aranya happens. So there is a Rama Rājya which happened prior to it. And what exactly would be the reason why, say, this ought to come about? Because one of the reasons why Ramavatara took place is to ensure that those beings which are yet to attain moksha, they also attain their moksha, is a formulation that we already have. So in such a formulation, if at all Rama Rājya continues forever, then only those beings who are ready for moksha, they are the ones who might get to take birth. But whereas there are several other beings who aren't yet ready for moksha, they still have their karma vipaka, which is yet to happen. And it is in that light that the Ramavatara would have to come to a certain end. It is at that time that we find Shambhukavatha and also Sita's banishment. Both these are in the last years of Rama's reign, because that is a transition that is actually spoken of, because there cannot be a continual Rama Rājya at any moment in time, because that is the nature of the world that we live in. Might be paradoxical, and it might appear to be strange, but that is indeed the way in which the world works, because the good and the bad, they are two sides of the same coin, and dharma, adharma are the same formulation. So the necessary way in which those beings who aren't yet ready for it, they also ought to take birth, and the continual Rama Rājya wouldn't have given that formulation, and that is an unjust scenario. So the banishment of Sita from memory is a point which is indeed, say, a point which understands the nature of memory so very, say, mundanely, because had it not been for these significant events, Shambhukavada, for example, who would have actually remembered the name Shambhuka to this day? This is a point which actually is playing out in what we today know of as the Paraloka. I've indeed spent some time with you on the way in which Paraloka is to be understood, and Paraloka as that which is the memory of people in public space. That the fact that, say, Sita can never be erased from the memory is because, say, there are these variety of scenarios that she has faced, which every woman possibly faces at different points in time, even to this day. And the supremacist part which is spoken of, whether it is something that enables us to understand what the Itihasa says, or is it our own superimposition of our ideals onto what are the ideals that are conveyed by Itihasa, that is a question that one must pose for oneself. There is a point also to be made about whether, say, Sita's embrace of earth after delivering her twins to Rama, so that the Raghuvamsha's lineage continues post-Rama, would that be something which ought to be treated as a tragedy? So Itihasa, in Uttarakanda, you would find that such a story is something that is taken to be a matter which happened, so therefore it would indicate what is it that happened. When Uttaramacharitam gets written by Bhavaputi, he alters this, and he places the embrace of Sita. So the banishment of Sita doesn't happen in the beginning of Rama's reign, but it happens at the beginning. And by replacing this, what Bhavaputi does in Uttaramacharitam is that he would speak of Sita being re-embraced, and they reign together for 10,000 years, 11,000 years post that. So this formulation is something that is done in Uttaramacharitam, and there is a way in which we find Sanskrit traditional playwrights and also the Vimarshakas, the people who have critiqued Sanskrit drama. They pointed out that Sanskrit drama has categorically stated that one cannot portray tragedy as a part of Nataka. That there are no tragedies in any of the Natakas is a very important element that one finds. And in Itihasa, is it that we find a tragedy? And that is a point where there may be some kind of a dissension amongst the current scholars, but the traditional scholars have always portrayed that there is nothing tragedy, nothing of a kind of tragedy. It is peculiar to say what one finds in the Greek thought. Greek thoughts and Greek tragedies are indeed, say, remarkably significant for the kind of as Aristotle's Poetics has actually tried to tell us about the way in which, say, the tragic occurrence would result in our own realization of the nature of truths where we are placed in. So that's a formulation which, when it comes to an itihasa, it has a different connotation. And we notice specifically that Sita's embrace of Mother Earth, where she is, ending her own stay on Earth, is that a matter of fulfillment to her? Is that a matter of contentment to her? Or is that a matter of sorrow? That is a question where the sense of the tragic and the sense of non-tragic ought to play. The sense of an itihasa is something that can only happen when there is a sense of accomplishment, sense of contentment, sense of fulfillment. That sense of fulfillment, when it is actually removed from the way in which we understand itihasa, it actually becomes what we today call as historic. So the sense of modern history is possibly a repeated versions of varieties of tragedies that keep on playing out. And indeed, the entire analysis that what we find in Professor Ramchandra Gandhi's look at the Ayodhya issue places itself in the historical framework and in the formulation of Greek framework, while of course using the metaphors and templates that are native to Indian darshanas. But this analysis cannot actually be called as a point that can be defensible in any of the Indian darshanas. This is a point that requires a great degree of defense, but I do intend to make this as a statement. The further point that requires to be noticed is that the effort that is made in this also points to the notion of Sankarya that we spoke of in the previous session. Sankarya is a very important aspect that can happen not just in terms of Varna Sankarya or Dharma Sankarya, but it is something that also brings about a Bhava Sankarya. So if I were to summarize what was Professor Ramchandra Gandhi trying to convey, he would think that there has been a trespass and appropriation that happened in 1949 over the sacred space of Sita's kitchen, which could accommodate a mosque. And it did not have any effect. It did not have any impact till in 1986, when the Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's government, right after the kind of backlash that happened in the Shabano case, wanted to alleviate the Hindu sentiments and also woo the Hindu voters. And it is in that context, these are all events, the variety of events that happened, which resulted in the opening of the locks of the Babri Masjid, where these locks were still placed since 1949. And it is only after that that one finds that the movement towards the building of Rama Mandir takes off. So this particular point, should it be just read as a matter where the nature of causality is solely temporal in its nature? So even if, say, one were to take the manner in which Sri Ramana would have spoken of, nature of causality insofar as what Bhagavad Gita tells us, or what we notice in terms of Sanatana Dharma, it cannot be something that can only be placed within the notions of temporal transactions that happen. For every kind of activity that one finds, the nature of Karana can actually be found at various planes. So we indeed speak of Adhibhuta, Adhidaiva, and Adhyatma. So the nature of Karanas are again, say, things which can be spoken of at these planes, and the karana for what happens in Adhibhuta is the Adhyatma. And that which enables this to happen is the strength of the divine Adhidaiva. So it is actually important to understand that these terms which are there, they aren't things which are, say, completely alien to our own understanding. I'd like to say, briefly share, say, the points where these come in, so that it will clarify that we are not speaking of things which are, say, extraneous to what we can understand. So here is a table which speaks of Adhibhuta, Adhidaiva, and Adhyatma. I'd like to take this example of Rupa, Netra. So Netra, as we understand, is our eye, and Rupa is form of any object which is out there in reality. So when we speak of any form of any object which is out there in reality, it is actually a referent to that which is in Adhibhuta. And the Adhyatma for the same happens to be Netra. So when one refers to, say, Adhyatma, to call it spiritual would possibly mean that we do not understand that it is something which is, to understand that as only which is esoteric, something that is beyond what happens, is possibly, say, fine in some instances. We'll look at that also. But it is something that is a categorical classification which has a logic of its own, a rationale of its own, whose details would and whose formulation would enable us to look at what happened at Ayodhya in 1949, Common Era, and what happened post that, what happened in 1986, what happened in 1992, 6th of December. All these will have a different formulation in which they get placed. Of course, it is a point to understand, say, whether the kind of Hindu-Muslim hatred that one gets to see, is that what is the kind of thing that it ought to trigger? And if at all we do have a kind of narration, the kind of way in which we describe what is happening solely in these lines, and possibly, say, the approach to try and look at what would be the way in which this adversity can be turned to a spiritual advantage, the sense in which we can reach out to the Adhyatma level, is something, because spiritual there is indeed, say, a reference to Adhyatma that even Professor Ramchandra Gandhi would agree. So take a look at this, that which is actually, say, thought of, Mantavya, is Adhibhuta. So not everything that is Adhibhuta is something that can be stated to be out there. It is also something that happens in terms of the mentation of the mind. And Adhyatma is the mind. Nischaya, definitive decision that one takes, is in Adhibhuta. And Adhyatma, for it, is Buddhi. So these are, say, in fact, the classification of Adhibhuta, Adhidaiva, Adhyatma is something that we find Bhishmacharya tell Yudhishthira when he asks for what these are. And all that happens is something that can be understood in terms of the varieties of combinations by which these come together. So, in fact, Karya and Karana are again, say, pointed out insofar as this specific formulation. So Adhibhuta is the Karya and Adhyatma would be the Karana. And that which actually enables for that to happen, the kind of invisible force which should enable that Karya to happen from the Karana, is what is the referent to the Adhidaiva. We did spend some time on the Adhidaiva Tadharana. So when referring to, say, the Bharata Bhumi and its sacred geography. So all of it ought to be, say, understood in the formulation of these basic principles that are given. So to get back to say Sita's kitchen, where the call for Rama's banishment of Sita, in fact, this is a specific occasion which has been meditated on by not one poet, but almost all poets who have actually spent time with Ramayana. And one of the very insightful kind of points that we find happens to be from Kundamala of Dinnaga, who was a Buddhist. And Dinnaga's Kundamala, there is a very important point that Sita herself raises. She asks, is it at all possible for Rama to banish me, and can Rama ever banish Sita? So there is that kind of a unity that is spoken of between the man and wife, and that sense of the unity between, say, the man and wife is something that ordains the divinity which is actually present in that sacred union, that also in the formulation of Sanatana Dharma, it would say that with effort, you do find that man and wife, with appropriate effort, they can think of begetting the Lord himself as their child. This is a story of Kausalya and Dasaratha. This is a story of Vasudeva and Devaki. So that formulation is what actually is the regenerative impact and regenerative sense that is present in the Indian thinking, which possibly one would not find in other kind of religions, because the formulation of who would one call as Ishvara is in itself very subtle, and it also allows for an avatara when it comes to, say, this formulation that we have. So the avatara vada itself requires to be understood for it to actually make that sense, and that avatara vada is something that refers to Ishvara as Saguna Sakara, and we have Ishvara as Saguna Nirakara and Nirguna Nirakara. All these three planes are actually mapped onto our own various states in Jagrat, Swapna and Sushupti, and this is what we learn from our own darshanas. So given this richness that is present, to speak of, say, what happened on the 22nd, 23rd, 1949 Common Era, whose details is something that are not embedded in this accounting that is given, except for thinking of it as a kind of trespass and appropriation. It calls us for us, it makes, it's imperative that an attempt is made to understand what exactly happened in those days. So here I'd have to narrate to you that story of Swami Karpatriji and the kind of efforts which happened post 1940, wherein there has been a conscious attempt from the Sanatanis, including, say, the various Pithadipatis, including, say, a number of people who are Dharmashastris, who are Pandits, all of them in their formulation of how ought to be the post-independent era be envisaged. There was a number of debates and the kind of thoughts that indeed happened. One of the significant things that happened in the discussions when, say, India was sought to be a secular state post-independence, there was also the announcement of the celebration of 2,500 years of Gautama Buddha's parinirvana. So that formulation was something that met with a very sharp question. If at all the nature of the sense of a secular state that is going to take birth is going to be of this nature, that the Buddhist celebration is something that is a public celebration and not private, then it indeed would call for raising a question about, say, what would be the way in which one would deal with the kind of questions of the Ayodhya, Mathura, and Kashi temples, which have been in the memories of the people of these places, in the folklore, in the Sthala Purana. They have all had a formulation which indicate that an erstwhile temple has been, say, erased, raised, and in its place has come about a mosque, and some of its presence is also to be found now. So this memory is something that actually made, this sense of the past is what made the point of what ought to be the nature of action that needs to be thought of. So I have, say, a specific article which was published in Amar Ujala. This was right after the Rama-janmabhoomi judgment that came about. So I think there is some problem. I just have to share it once again. This is one of the various posts that came in that actually spoke of what happened and what is the kind of work which happened that spoke of the sense in which the appearance of these images and what is it that happened during the days of December 1949 Common Era in Ayodhya. I just read out a couple of points. तत्कालीन राजा बलरामपुर पाटेश्वरी प्रसाद सिंह, गोरक्षपीठ के महंत दिग्विजयनाथ, भारतीय रामराज परिषद संस्थापक स्वामी करपात्री जी, फैजाबाद के तत्कालीन डिस्ट्रिक्ट मैजिस्ट्रेट के नायर ने बनाई थी भूमिका, गोंडा के बलरामपुर के राजा के आंगन में बनी थी रणनीति, प्रतापगढ़ के भटनी गांव में हुआ था स्वामी करपात्री जी का जन्म. So this is something that is the place where the formulation came in, and then there is the reference of Rama-janmabhoomi ko mukt karane ki bani thi bhumika. So this story which is there, it actually starts with a yajna that was performed in order to reclaim the Rama-janmabhoomi, which was believed with the sense of past that these say saints and Raja, all their sense of past was indeed directed towards, say, reclamation, because post-independence, say, the reconstruction of Somnath Mandir is something that is well known, whereas in this instance, there is no specific kind of a effort which was moved, and it was Swami Karpatri ji who also founded the Akhil Bharatiya Rama Rājya Parishad that was also founded in 1949. So this formulation, this was founded in order that, say, the Rama Rājya is what is the direction in which post-independent era ought to, say, move towards, and the Rama Mandira's, say, Rama Mandira being constructed at Rama-janmabhoomi is to be seen as a kind of beginning of that effort. So such was the kind of a formulation, and this happened specifically in the post-partition era. So what ought to be the way in which partition be seen? So amongst the very few people who got arrested on the Independence Day of modern India, Swami Karpatri ji was fasting and he was jailed. And the reason for his jailing was because he fasted protesting against the partition, which key point to notice is the reference to the Adhidayavata Dharana, because several sacred Kshetras, Tīrthas and Kshetras, would no longer be accessible to devotees because of the nature in which this partition happened. And though that was not the kind of thought in which the Congress leaders of those times thought of partition. They in fact felt that partition could be temporary, and Pakistan as an idea and Pakistanis as their ability to govern themselves is something that is not so strong. So Sardar Patel had a formulation where he felt that within no time, Pakistanis would run to say that let us unite again. So this formulation would call for us to as well understand the kind of say dynamics within which say the post-partition politics also played out, because throughout say the Congress reign, one would notice that there was never ever an effort made to concretize partition. It's only post the BJP government, the majority rule under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, that Shri Narendra Modi, that we currently find that partition and its rigidification as something that is finality has been accepted, and that the shining example of the same is the way in which Article 370 of the Constitution of India, which was shown up as India's response to counter the two-nation theory. So in fact, the entire formulation of Indian National Congress was that Article 370 indicates that you can have a Muslim majority state within India, and it can indeed be having its own rule without any kind of a trouble. And the federal principles are indeed possible to be observed. So that was a response that the Congress government used to give to the world to speak of the shallowness of the two-nation theory, which also found its death knell when one understands that the partition of the 1971 war resulting in the East Pakistan turning to Bangladesh was also one of the points which actually ought to be understood. But more importantly, in both the East Pakistan as well as West Pakistan and subsequently in Bangladesh, the fact that say there has been a great degree of reduction in the Hindu populations is a point, and also the kind of ways and means by which one notices that the sacred places, Tīrthas and Kshetras in Pakistan are in dilapidated states. It's only very recently that one finds that about 20 years ago that Shri L.K. Advani was invited by Pakistan to visit Katasraj temple. And even to this day, say there are some such efforts that one finds once in a while, but majority of the Tīrtha Kshetras are no longer present, and they are no longer being, say, catered to, because there's no Nitya Puja, Naivedya that happens there. So it was on this point that Swami Karpatriji has fasted, saying that what the partition has done, it's not about, say, the loss of a territory or something, but it has actually resulted in the loss of the sacred spaces. And in the light of the loss of these sacred spaces, if we do not even have the sacred spaces that we have within the leftover part, which has been left to us, it is in this context that the reclamation of Rama-janmabhoomi and its formulation came in. So in all of the analysis that happens, that one finds with Sita's Kitchen in Professor Ramchandra Gandhi's formulation, the reference to partition comes in as a kind of a matter of finality, but it is something that is actually blamed on the sense of a Muslim fundamentalism. But the claim is that a Hindu fundamentalist formulation isn't something which is a good response, because that would completely close out on the possibilities of a future kind of a reconciliation between the two countries. Now, this is a kind of, one could say that, say, such a kind of formulation may have its space, but what one would notice insofar as Rajaniti or any Niti is concerned is that strength respects strength. And when it comes to, say, the formulations that are there in this framework, the reclamation of Rama-janmabhoomi, when seen without, say, the taking into account partition of India, would possibly give you a skewed picture in itself. And unless and until one goes back to address, say, the state of affairs of what is it that partition of India has resulted in, one would not be at peace about what is the sense of our future also. So whether, say, Rama Rājya can, and the Rama-janmabhoomi's Rama Mandira construction can give us threads to work on, to think of the ways and means by which one can overcome partition, that is a question that requires due reflection. And on a different note, to think that what actually got demolished on the 6th of December 1992 was a masjid is possibly only one part of the story. Post the presence of the images, the Ramlala Virajman, the deity, the Vigraha in the central dome of Babri Masjid, and the belief of people that the very presence there is something that means that, say, though puja is not happening, or the very presence of the deity there ought to mean that, say, that structure, which was an erstwhile mosque, becomes a temple. So what was it that was demolished? There may be a point in people stating that it is Babri Masjid that got demolished, but it is equally the case that there was a temple with an architecture which was not based on Agama Shastras that got demolished. So this is an angle which, say, would not actually find a public space argument, because one does not ask the key question about what happens to the idols, these vigrahas, which were actually, say, present when the demolition happened. And that is where a very important point needs to be noticed. An act which Pujya Pejawara Svāmī-ji, Sri Viśvaprasanna Swāmī-ji, who was a witness to the demolition of Babri Masjid, and his presence of mind has actually, say, done. And that requires due recognition and due understanding as well, because when it came to his notice that indeed, say, the central dome might as well be demolished, then there was a very important effort made to secure these vigrahas. They were brought outside safely, and they were reinstalled with proper procedures that very day post the demolition. Unless and until one actually pays due attention to what is the kind of process by which this entire thing happened, one may not be able to understand the causality of how things unfolded. So the story begins with the partition, post-partition, the efforts in terms of the sankalpa made in the yajna that was towards the reclamation of Rama-janmabhoomi, and the claim of the person who has placed the instrument, who has played the instrument in terms of placing the vigraha in the central dome, that which the Supreme Court considers is a trespass, which considers is a desecration of the mosque, if at all it is something that actually happened. If I actually narrate the story where it is indicated that there was a 12-day Ramcharitmanas Patha which happened, and when this Ramcharitmanas Path happened, on one of the nights there was a dream that came to the person who was asked to say that the presence of these my own images, the Lord Rama says, my own images are to be placed in there. And that actually is the resultant which turns out to be. So whether or not one actually would like to call it, say, acceptable in terms of the modern formulation, it would indeed be a case that one must specifically say is the case of faith and not blasphemy. So unless these points are indeed kept in mind, we wouldn't possibly be in a position to understand that sequence of how things unfolded. So I'd like to say, bring this session on the discussion of the manner in which the event of 6th of December 1992 Common Era needs to be understood here. And I would indeed say that Sita's Kitchen, the testimony of faith and inquiry, requires to be addressed in its core argument, and also the claim of both Advaita's Waterloo as well as Advaita's shame, both of which are one of the preeminent questions that counter any sense of imagining Varnashrama Dharma and the Chaturvarnya as per Shastras requires to be taken seriously, so as to, and it must be done within the formulation of the Darshana itself. And the Sankarya, which is actually present in it, which is treated as we have already seen as something that needs to be avoided by a traditional Indian mind, how when it in the current space becomes widely prevalent, how is it that one can find ways and means by which it can be addressed? That is the kind of challenge which requires to be faced head on, to be in a position to speak of Rama Rājya, and also to move towards realizing Rama Rājya, because it is indeed possible that a couple in Kali Yuga, with their own effort, with their own, say, deep tapasya, can indeed give birth to someone like Rama. So since that regenerative possibility is always open, there is effort that can indeed be made, and Raja Kalasya Karanam is also something that is already present. So these are the senses in which there is a scope for thinking about what would it mean towards, to be done towards realizing Rama Rājya. So I'd like to conclude this session for today here. In the final session that will happen tomorrow, I'd like to take up the points about how at all do we understand, say, the general principles of modern day polity, such as that of taxation, such as that of business. In what manner, say, Rama Rājya would deal with these questions. There are, of course, responses that one can give, and that would call for, say, an active interpretation of what is in Shastras and how at all this interpretation ought to be. There is also the important question and the kind of challenge that is thrown that normally speaking, say, Shastras would say that hereditary vocations are to be followed. And if hereditary vocations are to be followed, there are, of course, questions that are posed that if at all, say, one's own ancestors were actually scavenging, manual scavenging, should it mean that, say, in future also manual scavenging should continue? So these are questions which are important to be addressed. So we'll take up these questions to try and address them in as straight manner as possible by looking at, say, how is it that what is there in the text of a Shastra gets to practice, and that is and the imagination of which is something that is terribly lacking in the current times. So with this, I'd like to conclude, and before we do that, a short prayer. Apadama pahattaram dataram sarvasampadam lokabhiramam Sri Ramam puyo puyo namamyaham.